Hey there, so I'm just preparing the Court of Appeal injunction written submissions for the hearing, and I just wanted to reach out and ask people who have been posting letters that they've received from Jacinda Ardern's office and other members of parliament relevant to their responses to 1080, Mycoplasma bovis, any of the false disease narratives that are being used to cover up 1080 poisoning, everything from Legionnaire's disease to Myrtle's rust with the bees, to cowrie dieback with the cowrie trees, to TB and Mycoplasma bovis covering up the poisoning of the livestock through their water. So it would be great to get the original copies of those emails that were sent to you. I know lots of people have posted them on social media over the last period of months, and I have a contradictory statement from Jacinda Ardern that she hasn't given any detailed responses on 1080. For example, there was a letter distributed where she told her office told someone it was completely safe to eat puha. And after it had been 1080 poisoning, you would have seen I had an interview with Gerald Pollack yesterday, who's one of the world's leading scientists on water. He discovered the fourth phase of water, which is the intricate understanding of the fact that when water hits a living cell or a living riverbed, it becomes very ordered and structured, with a purpose and a capability to take on information, and which changes its nature. And so when the poison has been put in the water, it's actually restructuring the frequency of the water. And according to the latest science on water, the more diluted that water then becomes, having had that frequency of the poison in it, in fact, it becomes a more enhanced version of the poison in that way. And arguably, so when you put a reproductive toxin like 1080 in the water, which is it has several functions. One is to kill cells, one is to mutate cells, which triggers things like cancers. It chemically alters the mitochondria of the DNA and your chemistry, your entire body chemistry. So that's triggering things like depression or nervous system disorders and gut disorders, which is your gut is like your second brain, and it's connected to your brain. And then its other purpose is a reproductive toxin, so it targets the reproductive organs with those same effects like I've just said. So the effect of EDC chemicals, endocrine disruptor chemicals, causing cancers on the reproductive organs is very clear internationally. There's a lot of science on this. And so if you take the latest water science and understanding how water works and the nature of it, and you apply that, then you are restructuring the water to an enhanced version of this reproductive toxin that in diluted form, in massively diluted form. In fact, the more diluted it becomes, the more enhanced the frequency of the compound becomes. That's the science, and that's the age-old reliance for sort of things like homeopathy, which obviously that is hugely debated, but it's also hugely evidenced to work. So what this new science on water does is it firms up the explanation as to how it works and why. Not necessarily yet how, but it certainly shows the fundamental principles behind it working. And it's evidence beyond a shadow of a doubt now, from the time when Jacques Van Benest first started developing this and evidencing it to the scientists who are working on it now. It's the new frontier of science. It's the new frontier of physics and chemistry and everything that we understand about science, and that's been the nature of science since the beginning of time, is that it evolves. But obviously also there's the plain basic logic when you put one of the world's most lethal torture compounds in water. Whilst it might dissolve and dilute and you can't see it anymore in its original form, and we also know by the science that it metabolizes into degradation products like the fluorocitrate molecule, which is the killer element of this compound. So that's what goes on to kill the Krebs cycle, or interfere with the Krebs cycle to kill the cells, stop it transforming food and light and water into energy. So your cells die and mutate, which triggers the breakdown of your entire body. And that is responsible, that's the cause and effect of our massive collapse of the health system, our environmental system, the massive species extinction we're experiencing. It's really logical. When you put tons and tons of torture poisons right over your forest, you're going to have species extinctions. 1 + 1 = 2. You know, it's just blows my mind. And so it was just fantastic to speak to Gerald yesterday, who's one of the world's leading scientists, who said categorically that if you put torture poison in your water, it's going to have lethal effects, and it will lead to death and disease and complete collapse of the environmental status in New Zealand, just as it has. You know, our rivers and lakes and streams have all got toxic algae that are caused by these pesticide chemicals. And our health system is completely collapsing. And as I've noted in the past few weeks, there's been a serious effort from our very corrupt media, to internationally owned media, to promote this new epidemic of pneumonia that's coming up, which is exactly the symptoms that you will have when you get 1080 poisoning. You know, that in itself is well evidenced, but there's this sickness in New Zealand where even the Poison Centre denies what the whole world knows to be true, which is that this is a toxic chemical compound. They say there's no human side effects to it. It's a blatant lie. The media are blatantly lying. The state and Crown and government system are blatantly lying to allow mass chemical weapons program to continue against this country. And there is no doubt that the water science internationally, and there's some of the most, so I have a whole range of water scientists that I'm going to be speaking to, and some of the most amazing people at the frontier of understanding the consciousness and intelligence and capability to transform upon receiving new information that water holds, at the frontier of evidencing this. It's just, to all of them, it's just astonishing that no one in their right mind would put chemicals in water. You know, and when we spoke yesterday with Gerald, it's that water is sacred. You know, water is absolutely sacred. It's intelligence. You know, he began to understand the properties of water from starting and looking at how the muscle in the body can contract. And the muscle in the body has the power to contract because of the water, because of the information and intelligence and consciousness of the water that enables everything alive, every cell, every muscle, everything alive, from the microorganisms right up to function. Water is the greatest mystery of life, you know, and there's no way that anyone would put a toxic torture poison en masse in that water unless with intent to kill. And that is intent. I use the intent as defined by Article 30 of the Rome Statute, which is awareness of the consequence of harm that will be brought about by inflicting this kind of condition of life upon the people in the ecosystem. Our ecosystem is collapsing. We are having a species extinction going on that has been caused by a mass of toxic poisons being spread indiscriminately, industrialized aerial drops all over our country, our forests and our waterways, which then run into our agriculture systems through the troughs and poison the livestock and make them sterile, and run into the human system and is the cause for a mass of our health problems and a massive premature death. Now, when you look at this in relationship to the people who have the most money in the world, the most money, the most power, and their very public open statements for years saying, we need to depopulate this world, we need to depopulate. The only way to depopulate is to kill. And the only way to do, and the most logical way to do that is put a sterility toxin in the water. Well, 1080 is a sterility toxin. It's a male reproductive toxin. It was classified like that in 1998 in the US. And what's happening here is a great deception, a Goebbels big lie, where a whole lot of propaganda has been spread by people who are fanatical about reducing the world's population because they're not smart enough and not bright enough and not intelligent enough and not visionary enough to think of a better way. Because there are 1,000 better ways than mass genocide in order to achieve a balance, a rebalance in our society. And it's not about overpopulation, it's about imbalance in our money system, It's about imbalance in our ownership system. It's about monopolies and conglomerates that have evolved to the point where it's in fact the people who are responsible for inflicting this depopulation program are the ones responsible for the imbalance in our system. Now, I am so into capitalism and independence and freedom and, independent economies, independent currencies, because life is about human expression. Freedom and individuality is essential to enable that human expression, and our communist regime that's currently in power about control and suffocation and automating everything, and these 5G systems, the psychotronic weaponry power of them to inflict the DARPA mind control technologies that have been developed, terrifying. And there are apparently already 5G stations lined up down south. Wouldn't surprise me if it's in Southland, where we don't have elected councillors anymore. There are appointed commissioners, and that's another terrifying thing. I've had councillors say to me that when they've challenged this poisoning program, they've been warned that if you don't sort of step back in line, we will replace you with commissioners. That's a dictatorship of local city governance. At the moment, definitely with the massive public land disposal in Auckland, no need for commissioners, just get a whole lot of people sitting around that voting table who are willing to divest and dispose of everything that the public own and value. And then you'll have the imposition of political ideology without any resistance, because what can we do, There's a huge disempowerment movement going on in this country right now. There's a huge number of crisis narratives that have been deliberately triggered so they can deliver already pre-designed communist-style legislative changes that will forever change our way of life, eliminate our freedoms, and reduce the common people back to a slave race, basically, with the right to life, the right to freedoms, independence, the right to self-determination, the right to, create industry and trade and everything like that. That's all being eliminated right now. And when you see the new IPCC report coming out, you have to be concerned, because, they're saying things like, there was an article yesterday saying our meat consumption has to reduce by 90%. Now, the problem is I'm always this, I never sort of fit any of the molds, because, I totally agree we shouldn't be mass slaughtering animals. Sorry, I do. That's what the communists in power also believe. That's why they're... But I don't believe that the way we get there is by mass poisoning and state forced slaughter. I think it's about instead having an open, honest conversation with the farmers, talking about rebalancing the system based on some sort of ethical principles as well as economic. Putting a second body corporate under the Reserve Bank Act in place so that we can finance the farmers' transition and redesign our agriculture system so that we're not mass industrializing our farming, but that we are transitioning to a better balance of a range of products that we're farming that is much less orientated towards mass slaughter of animals. Deep down, most farmers don't want to mass slaughter their animals. So we do need to get more balance in the system, but not by criminally mass poisoning our country to death in order to fake create climate change by chemicals and force the legislative changes to divest agriculture, the primary industry, small farmers, and introduce a model of effective communist state farming with a Gestapo like MPI, forcing the slaughter of herds across the country as they perfected under the fake narrative of TB. And I say fake narrative of TB because everyone's really confused on that issue, but let's remember that the only evidence of TB being related to possums and cattle is that they both get sick in the same proximity to one area. And that's because, and when I trace back, and I haven't had my OIA requests met by docs, so it's very difficult to evidence this crime when they deliberately flout their responsibility under the law for disclosure. But what I do know anecdotally is that TB outbreaks, for example, in the 90s would happen directly after 1080 drops because it was sublethal doses of the poison that was causing these horrendous symptoms, just like it's exactly the same symptoms as promoted to you as M. bovis, which is exactly the same symptoms as when they artificially inflict TB by injection and call it Mycobacterium bovis. Mycoplasma bovis is the one promoted to you as the contagious disease that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world and is just a name given to a mutated mutated bacteria in a mutated cell, basically, that exists mutated because of toxicity. It's a result of toxicity. It's if you have 1080 poisoning, it mutates your cell or it kills your cell, So it's exactly the same thing, and it's been marketed as the reason to inflict this chemical program falsely, and then as the effect of the poisoning. There's a massive biosecurity frauds going on. There's no evidence to justify them, just intense propaganda from the media and a very, very fraudulent criminal government who are willing to make these false statements because they believe that they've got some sort of God-given right to completely change our way of life by fraud and deceit and killing. And it's wrong, and it's illegal, and it must be stopped. But first of all, someone in our system, whether in the judiciary or in the government or as the Governor General has the power to do, needs to stop this. Anyway, regardless, I continue my efforts. My civil claim is the one that I'm preparing my injunction application for the Court of Appeal at the moment, and that includes all the criminal conduct, but in isolation as a civil claim, technically the judge doesn't then have the right to hand out criminal judgments. It's a civil judgment that would be civil penalty that would be given. But regardless, all the crimes, everything from bioterrorism to treason to as simple as contaminating crops, contaminating water, all of it's covered in the civil claim. It's just a matter of penalty, which, I believe this is such a shocking crime of deceit, fraud and murder that I think the harshest penalties in the world should be given out to these people as an example, because, it's a shocking abuse of power to misuse democracy and trust in order to enforce political ideology by such criminal means, and that's what's happening. If they hadn't been spreading tons and tons of torture poison all over our ecosystem to deliberately kill and torture wildlife to death, contaminate our water, geoengineer our entire ecosystem, and mass murder effectively as that travels into our water supply, then there would be no climate change narrative to speak of, because nature is incredibly powerful to rebalance. These people are using technology and chemicals to weaponize weather and water, and it's a way to artificially create their crisis narrative of climate change, and the result of that, mark my words, if this is not stopped, is to divest sovereignty of every nation in desperation, because you'll have people like the Pope and the Queen and Bill Gates and all of the people involved in this who have already started calling for world government. They are using climate change to call for world government. This is a crime that was started by the Club of Rome back in the 50s. I often look at the dates of the UN beginning and then the original version of the IPCC beginning, the original sort of environmental crisis group beginning 3 years after the UN launching, and seeing, it was, based in America. So how many of the Nazis then traveled to America and became the head of the NSA, the head of NASA, the head of NATO, and it was just a transition. It was just a transition of a system and a more insidious, submersed way to bring about the change. There is a massive eugenics program going on in New Zealand right now. You can't inflict this level of chemicals on people, and people don't want to believe it. They want to believe the government line that the world's most lethal chemical in your water is safe, because they can't imagine the other reality, which is the fact that you've got people who have taken your parliament who are willing to kill you because they believe in a political ideology internationally that 7 billion people are too many and we need to reduce the population en masse. And the numbers that float around are 750,000, 750 million people. That's the goal, 750 million people or 500 million people. It's various versions. And also, a complete end to industrialized farming, things like that. Now, again, I want to say, I don't believe in mass slaughter, but the way to achieve this change is not through dishonesty and murder and poisoning. The way to achieve this change is through honest conversations with farmers and a financial incentive to bring about the transition to more ethical farming, And at the end of the day, what, we're in such a unique position right now to achieve more balance, because our meat is now contaminated, and if a second Reserve Bank body corporate was rendered under, as it can be under the Act, because the current Reserve Bank, who are deliberately restricting our currency so that we live in austerity, they are not exclusive under the Act. So we can we can take a financial mechanism where we have a dual currency and we have control to finance our way through a crisis. And if we were smart, we would issue that, because that enables us to finance our farmers through admitting that our meat is half the meat across the country is probably now toxically poisoned right now, and people are about to eat that, die of heart attacks, get pneumonia, Legionnaire's disease, which absolutely wipes them out, and have respiratory failure, have heart attacks and strokes out of nowhere, and have their reproductive organs targeted with cancers, ovarian cancer, incredibly painful, breast cancer, bowel cancer, prostate cancer. This is all the capability of that toxin, and it as I said, once it reprograms and restructures the water to the frequency of the chemical, you can't find the original compound anymore. That's the beauty of it, And ironically, the Queen is one of the biggest believers in this theory. She has her own personal homeopathic doctor. So, since 1080 started being inflicted across this country when she came to reign, and her husband is one of the original Nazi families who is quite outspoken about the need to depopulate the human population, it's quite reasonable to assume that their knowledge of the true properties of water, being able to, in diluted form, a compound that is diluted out of the water, is still becomes an enhanced. The water itself becomes an enhanced version of that compound. They know. They practice this science themselves for their health. So, now that some of the world's leading scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and a whole consortium of them have come to the point where they absolutely understand that this is the nature of water, its intelligence, its consciousness, it restructures and reprograms according to new information of the compounds submersed in it. That means our water right across the country now, due to these attacks that my High Court case, attempted to stop and did stop until 2 days after August 21st this year, all the attacks that have since happened have lethally poisoned our water right across our country, and that means a mass of, obviously we know all the animals are tortured through the bush, which is disgustingly criminal in its own right, and my case covers that too. But that is travelling through to our livestock, and that is travelling through to our human water supply, and people are getting sick because of that. There is a clear cause and effect. Now, obviously, with diluted form and the fluoride citrate molecule being hard to test for, but possible, and people being misinformed by the government by false science, and then a lot of people are unaware of connecting the dots, that their sudden 6-week cancer that takes them from their families and takes their life is murder by government order. And as soon as we start to reconcile that in New Zealand, we're going to have incredible grief, but then we're going to fix it and recover, start again, remediate our ecosystem. There's frequency technology that can remediate the poison out of the water almost immediately. We just need to be run by smart leaders, not criminals. That's all, and we can fix this.